It is the best-selling book of all time, translated into more than 3,000 languages, written over a span of roughly 1,500 years, by dozens of authors, on 3 continents, in 3 different languages. It has shaped laws, inspired wars, comforted the dying, and started revolutions. It is, of course, the Bible. But how did this ancient collection of scrolls become the single most influential book in human history? Who actually wrote it? And how did we end up with the version that sits on shelves today? In the next 15 minutes, we're going to trace the entire journey of the Bible, from oral storytelling in the ancient Near East, to clay tablets and scrolls, to the printing press, to the book you might have in your home right now. Let's get into it. First, let's clear something up. The Bible isn't really one book. It's a library, a collection of separate texts bound together that different religious traditions assemble in slightly different ways. Broadly, it's divided into 2 parts. The Old Testament, also called the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh by Jewish communities, contains history, law, poetry, and prophecy from ancient Israel. Books like Genesis, Exodus, Psalms, and Isaiah live here. The New Testament focuses on the life of Jesus of Nazareth and the early Christian movement that followed him, the 4 Gospels, the letters of Paul, and the book of Revelation. Importantly, the exact number of books varies. Protestant Bibles contain 66 books. Catholic Bibles contain 73, including additional texts called the deuterocanonical books. Eastern Orthodox Bibles include even more. So when someone says the Bible, they may not mean the exact same collection. To understand why these differences exist, we have to go back to the very beginning, long before anything was written down at all. Long before there were scrolls, there were stories spoken aloud, memorized, and passed down for generations among the peoples of ancient Canaan and Mesopotamia. Scholars believe the earliest material that would eventually become the Old Testament existed as oral tradition, tribal histories, genealogies, laws, and poetry, recited at gatherings, festivals, and around fires. Around the 12th to 10th centuries BCE, during the period of the Israelite tribes and the early monarchy under figures like David and Solomon, some of this material likely began to be written down first in fragments, later in longer connected narratives. This was a slow, gradual process. Different communities held different versions of stories. Some texts were written by court scribes documenting royal history. Others were composed by priests recording religious law. Over centuries, these various threads began to be woven together. Modern biblical scholarship, looking at language, writing style, and historical references, suggests that what we now call the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, was compiled from multiple older source documents, likely finalizing to something close to its current form around the 6th to 5th century BCE, during and after the Babylonian exile. This exile was a turning point. Stripped of their homeland and temple, the Israelite priestly class had a powerful incentive to collect, preserve, and standardize their religious and historical texts to hold on to an identity that war and displacement threatened to erase. Over the following centuries, more books were added. Historical accounts of kings and prophets, wisdom, literature like Proverbs and Job, poetry like the Psalms, and the writings of prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. By around 200 BCE, most of what we now call the Hebrew Bible existed in a form scholars would recognize, confirmed dramatically in the 20th century by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran, which included Hebrew biblical manuscripts over 2,000 years old. But there was still no single, universally agreed Old Testament. Different Jewish communities held different views on which books counted as scripture, a debate that would echo for centuries. As Jewish communities spread across the Mediterranean world following the conquests of Alexander the Great, many no longer spoke Hebrew fluently. Greek had become the common language of trade and culture. So, starting around the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria, Egypt's Jewish scholars began translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This translation became known as the Septuagint, named for a legend that 70 scholars worked on it. This mattered enormously. The Septuagint became the version of scripture most early Christians actually read, since the New Testament writers themselves wrote in Greek. Many quotations of the Old Testament found inside the New Testament are taken directly from this Greek translation, not the original Hebrew. This is also where some of those extra deuterocanonical books we mentioned earlier come from. They appeared in the Septuagint, but not all of them appeared in the later, narrower Hebrew canon used by Rabbinic Judaism. Now we move forward to the 1st century CE, the time of Jesus of Nazareth, and the Roman-occupied province of Judea. Jesus himself, according to all accounts, never wrote anything down. His teachings spread orally through his followers in the years immediately after his death. The earliest Christian writings we have aren't the Gospels, they're letters. The Apostle Paul wrote letters to early Christian communities across the Roman Empire starting around 50 CE, addressing real problems in real churches. Several of these letters are widely considered by historians to be the oldest surviving Christian texts. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written later. Most scholars estimate between roughly 65 and 100 CE, drawing on oral tradition, earlier written sources, and eyewitness testimony in order to record the life and teachings of Jesus for communities who had never met him directly. Over the following decades, dozens of other texts circulated among early Christian groups: letters, Gospels, Apocalypses, and church teachings. Not all of them made it into the final New Testament. Some, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, were eventually excluded, while others gained widespread acceptance. This raises an important question. Who decided which books belonged in the Bible and which didn't? The process is called canonization, and it didn't happen overnight or through a single decree. For the Old Testament, Jewish religious authorities had largely settled on their canon by around the 1st or 2nd century CE, debated in rabbinic discussions. Though scholarly conversation about its exact boundaries continued, for the New Testament, the process took longer. Early Christian leaders and theologians, figures like Origen, Eusebius, and Athanasius, debated which texts were authoritative, widely used in worship, and consistent with apostolic teaching. By the late 4th century, councils such as the Synod of Hippo and the Council of Carthage affirmed a list of 27 New Testament books that closely matches what most Christians use today. This wasn't really these councils inventing the list. It was more like formally recognizing a consensus that had been building for generations among Christian communities. Even after this, debates continued, which is part of the reason Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant Bibles still differ slightly today. For more than 1,000 years after this, the Bible existed only in hand-copied manuscripts, first scrolls, later in book form known as a codex, painstakingly copied by scribes, often monks, working for years in monasteries across Europe and the Middle East. Around 400 CE, a scholar named Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, producing what became known as the Vulgate, the standard Bible of Western Christianity for the next 1,000 years. Because every copy was made by hand, small errors, additions, and regional variations crept in over centuries. This is why modern scholars compare thousands of surviving ancient manuscripts to reconstruct the most historically accurate text possible, a field called textual criticism. Everything changed in 1455, when Johannes Gutenberg printed his famous Bible using a movable type printing press in Mainz, Germany. For the first time, Bibles could be reproduced quickly and in large numbers, rather than copied by hand, one page at a time. This coincided with a growing movement to translate the Bible out of Latin and into everyday languages: German, English, French, so ordinary people could read scripture themselves without relying solely on clergy. Figures like Martin Luther and William Tyndale translated the Bible into German and English, respectively, often at great personal risk, since such translation was controversial and, in some cases, considered a punishable offense by religious authorities at the time. In 1611, the King James Version was published in England, commissioned by King James I, and it would go on to become one of the most influential English translations in history, shaping the English language itself for centuries. Today, the Bible has been translated, in whole or in part, into more than 3,000 languages, more than any other book in history. Modern scholarship continues to refine our understanding of its texts using archaeology, linguistics, and newly discovered whatever someone's personal beliefs about its religious truth, the Bible's historical journey is, on its own, an extraordinary story of oral memory becoming written word, of scattered scrolls becoming an organized canon, and of a regional religious text becoming a global cultural force that has shaped art, law, language, and history for thousands of years. And that's the story from ancient oral tradition to the books sitting on shelves around the world today. If you found this interesting, let me know in the comments which part of the Bible's history surprised you the most. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any single section, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospels, or the King James translation, let me know, and I'll cover it in a future video. Thanks for watching.